Flagellation brothels and those kind of services was so popular that flagellation became known as the English vice.
I don't know why you'd want to be whipped with metal.
So much spanking that goes on each other all the time. One of the estimates that gets bandied around a lot is 80,000, that there were 80,000 women selling sex on the streets of London in the 19th century.
Hey Kate, thanks for coming back on the show.
Anytime, thanks for asking me.
I sometimes feel sorry for the Victorians because I think we have these weird views on them, almost uniquely in our history. We think of this group of people who are either so prudish and so conservative, they never even seen their partner naked and we're surprised they could even find where to put it and have kids. Or we think of them as unbelievably deviant and having wild sex parties in the slums of Victorian England. Like what's the reality? Are they so different from any other period?
I think the first thing you need to think of when you talk about the Victorians is that all of these things can be true at the same time.
Okay.
But they're a very complex group of people. I'm not sure if they're any stranger than any point in history, but perhaps what makes them unique is it's the Industrial Revolution. And it's the time of photography. It's the time when film is born. It's the time of the mass printing media. The newspapers are taking off. Literacy rates are going through the roof. So there's more remaining sources with which to document their strangeness.
So you look at a Hogarth print from the 18th century and you're like, oh, you're not, that just feels foreign. Whereas you look at early photography of like naked people and Victorians doing weird things, like, oh my God, so deviant.
Right? And they were a uniquely strange bunch of people in the fact that they did have this outer facing public persona of let's not talk about sex. Sex is something that's just for making babies, and we're not going to be deviant, and everyone's just going to behave themselves. But that's not the whole picture. They're really, really conflicted because you can't actually maintain that because people are going to have sex and they like having sex. So you get a real state of cognitive dissonance developing.
Yeah, because when I'm like reading Victorian novels, you're so struck by that. One of the strongest elements of those is they could be in the middle of a war zone or being attacked by a mythical beast, or in a Conan Doyle novel, like a dinosaur. But any suggestion that you would have an inappropriate conversation with a member of the opposite sex is like, no.
Yeah, they were kind of very different from us, whereas we talk about sex all the time, but don't talk about something like death. The Victorians talked endlessly about death and wouldn't talk about sex. So it's just changing attitudes.
I thought you might be about to say that. We talk about sex all the time and are having historically less sex than ever before. And the Victorians never talked about it, but they might have been in a way happily.
They might have been. What they were, I mean, were all the living, walking, breathing proof that people in the Victorian period, someone was having sex.
There's no wireless, not much else to do.
Right?
Yeah.
And you've got to think as well, if this is a group of people that they were not obsessed with sex, but by sheer virtue of the fact that there is so much upset and anger and attempts at repression. If you're running around going, I'm not thinking of sex, are you thinking of sex? Who's thinking of sex? Why are you thinking of sex? I'm going to punish anyone who's thinking of sex. Are you thinking of sex? That's not a group of people who don't think about sex. That's a group of people who can't stop thinking about sex.
Let's talk about Queen Victoria, the one who gives the period its name. Again, she has a sort of bad rep because we can't. She actually had a very happy. In fact, it's odd that we think of her as this kind of cold, lie back and think of England person, because she seemed to have an unusually happy marriage and sexual relationship with her partner, even though it was an arranged marriage and everything. They got like a house on fire.
They really did. We think of Victoria often in like her frump era, which is when she was mourning for her husband and she was dressed in black and she was just walking around being cranky and sad, and that's what we tend to think of her. But she was so in love with this guy, and not just, she fancied the pants off him. Like, she writes in her diary after the night of the wedding night that she can't stop staring at his chest and his neck, and he's perfectly formed and he's beautiful. Like, she wanted to jump on Albert's bones all of the time. She was not a prudish frump. And that phrase, lie back and think of England, that's a bit of an urban myth. That's it's come to represent what we think of as Victorian women, but the earliest recorded use of that phrase, I think, is in like the 1980s. Yeah, it's one of the many myths that we attribute to the Victorian period, that they weren't enjoying sex.
And her daughter went through and blacked out lots of her diaries, didn't they? But they were racy.
They were racy for the time. Like, one of the things that she had done is she had a portrait painted of her Queen Victoria did, and given to Albert that was only for his private viewing. And you can see it. It's not very. It's not exactly OnlyFans. She's got her hair loose and she's got bare shoulders and a dress that kind of like drapes and she's sort of staring off. But for the time, that was racy as hell. That was like the 19th century equivalent of send nudes.
Was there different sexual mores in the sort of this new middle class, sort of hard-working bourgeoisie, compared to the working class or the aristocracy?
Yeah, a lot of what we think about the Victorian period comes from the emergence and the expansion of what we now call the middle class. Arguably, there's always been a middle class, but what happened in the 19th century is this idea really starts to expand and social mobility starts to come in like it had never done before, really. I mean, you could, I guess, be born in the gutter and make your way to the top, but that was really difficult. What you see in the Victorian period is an expansion of industry, an expansion of wealth, new money starts to emerge. And right in the middle of that is what's called the middle class. And they seem to be the guardians of this very Victorian morality. If you read through the medical advice, the legal advice, the general conduct codes, pamphlets that are really strict about what you can and you can't do, one of the things that becomes apparent pretty quickly is that you haven't got time for that if you're working in a factory. You don't like the idea that, you should never expose your ankles to anyone. Actually, they weren't that fussed about ankles, but, that you should never see anybody naked or anything like that. That's not going to work if you're a whole family living in one room in a slum, is it? So there were different expectations for where you were on the social rung.
And it was a way of expressing your newfound sort of place in society
Yeah.
to just be.
Yeah, you might not have as much money as the aristocrats, but god damn it, you're going to be better behaved than they were. Because if you're an aristocrat, you're kind of off the hook immediately because you've got the money to be able to do whatever the hell you want.
Sex work, I think, possibly from stories of the Whitechapel murders, Jack the Ripper, from Sherlock Holmes, whatever it might be, we have this sense of the streets of London teeming with sex workers. Is there any evidence it was sort of more or less than other periods?
We've definitely got evidence that the Victorians were really worried that it was.
Gladstone was worried, wasn't he?
Well, he was desperately worried. He was so worried that he would go roaming the streets of London in the evening looking for fallen women to save.
Yeah.
He was that worried.
That's very worried.
Thanks, Gladstone. That's really helping stuff. But you've got evidence of Victorian moralisers and doctors making estimates of how many people were selling sex in London, for example. And one of the estimates that gets bandied around a lot is 80,000, that there were 80,000 women selling sex on the streets of London in the 19th century. That's just bollocks. Not right. We don't know how many people are selling sex today. We don't have those accurate statistics. It's a very, very difficult group of people to survey properly, with it being stigmatized, illegal, and people not wanting to say much about it. How they would have had accurate records in the 19th century, it's ridiculous. But the best estimates that we've got today, according to the government report into sex work in the UK of 2016, is they estimate there's about 80,000 people selling sex in the country. So the idea that in the 19th century there was 80,000 selling sex in the capital on their own, and when you break that down, it would mean like 1 in 5 women, regardless of age or marital status or anything else. So it's nonsense. That it couldn't possibly be that. But people believed it, and that's useful as well, because that tells us that if they thought that it's feasible that there's 80,000 people selling sex, they thought this was a really, really big problem.
So it's almost like it would have been medieval London, Georgian London, there would have been sex work going on, but the Victorians started to really notice it, write it down, make lots of noise about it, and then we've just absorbed that and be like, oh, there must have been an explosion in this. Yeah.
I mean, there would have been an increase because of urbanisation, as the cities doubled, tripled in size within a very short space of time, within a few decades. The rule of thumb is wherever you've got poverty, you've got someone selling sex. That's how it works. People sell sex because they want to make money. They don't sell sex because they're innately horny, or this is a useful hobby to do in their spare time.
And you have made a career for yourself publishing words for prostitutes from the 19th century on the internet.
Yeah.
That's Do you want to share any?
Let me see. I think one of my favourite words for someone selling sex is a dolly mop. That's not 19th century, it's a bit earlier, but a dolly mop is somebody who works, who has a job, but tops up their income by selling sex from time to time. So you'd say that you were dolly mopping if you were on a low income. I've always liked that, a dolly mop.
What about the more extreme forms of sexual activity that, again, for some reason, we keep labelling the Victorians as being into? You know, flagellation.
They did love that, though.
Did they?
They did.
Was that a boarding school? Was that a sort of?
That's the theory. That's what a lot of people say, is because lots of English boys were beaten in boarding schools. They got used to a love of the lash. I don't know if that's actually true, if anyone's looked into that as an actual research project, but that's certainly something that I have heard people suggesting. They might have been interested in that long before that. They probably were. We just don't have the records for it. But flagellation brothels and those kind of services was so popular that flagellation became known as the English vice.
Really?
Yeah, it was like, there's some really big Victorian players who were really into it. Charles Algernon Swinburne, for example, he was a bit of a spank fetish.
So, yeah, in terms of fetish, there's also like Penguin have published all those amazing like Victorian sexual fantasy books, which are amazing, and there's a lot of. You get the pressure because there's a global empire at this stage. There's a lot of stuff about interethnic sex, like There's like there's sex on the imperial frontier.
Yeah.
People are fascinated by it.
When you read Victorian porn, and I suggest everyone listening does, and you can access it online, because obviously the print industry was booming. People are going to write pornographic stories. Photographs are expensive. I often caution my students when I tell them to go and read it. They sort of approach it with this idea of like, oh, go on then, Victorian person, go and show me what you've got. We've got Pornhub. What have you got? And it really is quite graphic. It's not quite graphic. It's extremely graphic.
Yeah.
It's like whatever it is that you can think of, they have written it down. But it's I enjoy reading it because it's written in Victorian prose, and it sounds like Jane Austen, just like writing the most weird smut. And at the time, the standard of writing would have been really trashy, but because it's got that Victorian flourish to the expression, to me it sounds really funny. I really like reading it.
And you get flagellate, you get spanking, flagellation.
Oh God, you get so
much
much
torture,
of
like
it.
a lot of masochism. And
So much. The Whippington Papers, that was quite a popular publication. There is so much spanking that goes on each other all the time. They seem to do that a lot. They really love a good bush. Bush is lush. There's no Brazilians to be had. But there's just like threesomes, foursomes, orgies, same-sex relationships, dildos. It's actually really useful for historians because it answers questions for us like, what did they make dildos out of? Leather. That's what they made dildos out of. So it's good for us that we can know this stuff. But no, it's no holds barred, and whatever you can think of doing, they were doing.
Tell me about Teresa Barclay.
Oh, Mama Teresa. She owned a brothel, a hugely successful brothel on Charlotte Street, as was in London. And we know about her because her name and her establishment is recorded by, I think it's Henry Ashby, who wrote annual reviews of basically all the pornography. That it was like his Liberum Prohibitorum or something like that. And we only know about her because of what he wrote about her. But he writes about her brothel and the services that she offered, and that was whippings and fustigations, and that he tells us about the people she had working for. And one of the things that I love about Teresa is we're told that she keeps nettles in long vases of water to keep them pliant, and then she'd whip customers with those.
I don't know why you'd want to be whipped with a nettle.
Well, I think you work your way up to it.
Oh, do you think so?
I would like you start with a bit of light slap and tickle, maybe throw in some greenery, and then eventually work your way up to a holly bush.
Wow. That is you just get pushed to extremism, don't you?
You've got to keep going, more and more and more and more.
Yeah.
But she was the woman to go to.
So we're making the assumption that these services and this kind of sex industry is for men.
Yeah.
What about women? Were they just locked in home reading this porn and dreaming of a different life, or did they get a chance to go out and?
I hope that they were reading this porn. If you wanted to buy porn in the 19th century, you would go to Holywell Street in London, which is now, then it became the epicenter of journalism. But it was notorious in the 19th century as being the place that you would go to buy porn, the Whippington Papers and Memoirs of a Flea and all that stuff, and the Pearl. But of course, what it necessitates that we don't have to do now is you have to physically go there. You have to physically go there. And everybody knew what those shops were. Everybody. There was no, I'm just buying it for the articles. Everybody knew. So I don't know how many women, respectable women, would have done it, that they would have gone and actually, because everyone would have known, you're buying porn, you're buying porn. But I imagine that it wouldn't be that hard to get hold of it if they really, really wanted to. Maybe their husband shared it with them. But I think it's a bit of a fantasy, a bit of a myth that every single Victorian woman was just sat at home waiting for her husband to come back and thinking, what is this sex that you speak of? Maybe for some people, that's true. We've certainly got accounts of that. But they were having sex and they were having plenty of sex. And we've got a lot of evidence of that.
They're popping out babies.
Certainly are.
And
Left,
one
right and centre.
usually requires the other.
It does, doesn't it?
But there were male, in the pornography that you have shared on
Yes.
the interweb,
Yes.
in your
You're
excellent
welcome.
social media accounts, there are men, like there's a lot of male nudities, a lot of male pornography as
yeah.
well. Is that for men or is that for women, or do we know?
The biggest market has always historically been men, but that certainly doesn't mean that women were not part of that. Just by virtue of the fact that they didn't own their own money, that they couldn't have had access to it, that they would have been stigmatized in a way that perhaps men weren't, even though they were stigmatized. But that doesn't mean that they weren't enjoying sex. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't have got gigolos, for example, kept men. Catherine the Great certainly had a harem of young lovers. She could afford to do that. But yeah, the men in those, I love looking at those old daguerreotypes and the old photographs showing the Victorian porn and just wondering, who are these people? I know that's not the point. I know you're not supposed to like want to do a deep dive family history of them, but like it's all that we've got left of them is just this snapshot of what are you doing? Like, did you know each other? Were they porn stars of the day? And sometimes you see them in different shoots and you're like, I know you. You're the one from there. And then you kind of think, I wonder if that's how they made their living, or if it's just something that they did on the side.
And you never think, am I watching too much Victorian porn?
I think you are watching too much Victorian porn when you start thinking things like that.
Recognising.
We start recognising them when you start being like, oh, it's you.
That pert little bottom.
Yeah.
Recognise that. So what did Victorians think was hot? Well, yeah, and let's start with women. What do they think was a beautiful female body?
What did women think was a beautiful
What
female body?
that's...
Well, it changes a lot throughout the century.
Okay.
We're talking about 100 years. The fashion in the mid 19th century was sort of very plain, the no makeup look, hair kind of all piled up and just very kind of natural. And by the time you get towards the end of the 19th century, a heavier makeup look is coming through. But there are certain things that have been consistent throughout: healthy skin, glowing face. It was all about being pale, pale, pale. There were no tans. The whiter the better. So that was considered beautiful. But yeah, changes.
What about body shape?
Body shape. It's interesting because that again changed throughout the 19th century. For women, it tended to be petite. It tended to be very slender. There was at one point in the 19th century where it was like TB chic. It was like it was the fashion to look as pale and frail as you possibly could. But there were people that bucked that trend. And speaking of things that women found attractive, so like someone like Eugene Sandow, the bodybuilder. He probably wasn't the first bodybuilder, not by a long shot, but he was definitely one of the first that got celebrity status. And he would go on tour flexing his muscles, and he attracted huge crowds of people. Apparently women would pay to go backstage and finger his muscles.
I'm glad you said muscles. Okay, so he was like because this was also the era of the music hall and entertainment. So he was part of that.
He's huge, yeah.
Yeah, but you do see the strong man is like a figure in circus and stuff like that. So that was presumably.
And strong women, they often get overlooked in Victorian history, but there were very, very successful Victorian strong women. There was a female Eugene Sandow who apparently beat him in a wrestling match once.
Wow.
Yeah.
And Eugene Sandow, didn't they sort of studied him? They thought he was a sort of proper specimen.
He got studied a lot by all kinds.
Fingered a lot.
Oh, he did. But like people like him became a safer repository for the female gaze. You couldn't go down Holywell Street and buy yourself some porn, but you could go and look at Eugene Sandow and admire his physique. But certainly science took an interest. I think that the Wellcome Trust still have pictures of him flexing his muscles and his physique, and various casts and things were taken of him to try and preserve this absolute specimen. When you look at it now, because this is all steroids and
protein shakes,
pre-protein shakes, you look at him now and you think he's ripped, but it's not like what you'd think, this huge pumped up thing. But for the time, yeah, he was an absolute specimen of manhood.
Why have I heard of Lily Langtry? What's the deal with her?
Oh, Lily Langtry. She was one of the last great courtesans. She was an actress, but the 19th century certainly, that was sort of the last great era of the courtesan, and Lily Langtry was one of the great. She was one of the many lovers of Dirty Bertie.
Edward the Seventh, as he became.
Edward the Seventh, yeah.
Absolute shagger.
Absolute, like couldn't, if it stayed still long enough, he would have a go at it. And there's one immortal line by Lily Langtry when she was having dinner with Edward, and he said, "Damn it, woman, I've spent enough on you to build a battleship." And she retorted, "And you've spent enough on me to float one."
Oh, crikey. Crikey. And speaking of that, what about STDs?
Yeah, it was. I mean, all of the sexual freedom and that was emerging, and the porn and all this stuff. It doesn't capture and what was a very real physical threat to people's health. And we live in a world now where it's not that we're not aware of STDs, but it's that we know that probably what we'll need is a course of antibiotics or medication, some awkward phone calls, and you'll probably be okay. And you can wear a condom and not get them in the first place, and that's great. The 19th century and earlier, that was just a fanciful dream. STIs were absolutely rife, as you can imagine. And if it's something like syphilis, which is on the rise again, by the way, so everyone needs to watch out for that one. But syphilis is such a mean, horrible illness because it destroys your face. When you first get it, you'll get really intense flu-like symptoms as it takes hold, and you will get ugly lesions at the point of infection. So, yeah. And it'll be really, really nasty. And then it'll go dormant again, and you'll think that you've cured yourself, which is probably why when people were taking mercury, they thought, oh, I'm cured, because it went into its tertiary phase, but it hasn't gone away. It's there in the background, and it's destroying nervous tissue, and it's destroying bone, and then it can emerge years later, and the typical saddle nose of the nose that's collapsed can cause lesions on the head. It causes ulcers to open up. It can cause dementia. It was an awful disease. And there's no hiding it. If your nose has fallen off, there's no hiding that. And there's no other reason for your nose to have fallen off. It's really difficult to explain that one away. So it was rightly feared. It was terrifying. They would do almost anything to avoid it, apart from not having sex.
Well, so...
We never did that bit.
Yeah. So what can you do to avoid it other than not having sex?
Right. So there was all kinds of bat crap cures and things. Some of them, well, none of them were great. If you were rich and if you had the money, and after you'd been infected, mercury was your go-to.
I mean, that works.
I've never actually known. I wanted
Okay.
to ask a physician this question for years and years, and none of them have actually been able to give me an answer to it of like, what did it do? Because it wasn't just the Victorians that used it. They've used it since the 14th century. What did it do that made people think it was helping? The best answer that I've got is that it would help burn off lesions. So you could put it on the lesions and it would sort of help with the appearance. But there were mercury fumigation places that you could go to around London that you'd sit in like a sauna and be steamed with mercury. You could have mercury injected, you could eat mercury, you could rub it on your skin. And one of my favourites, and they recovered one of these from the is it the Mary Rose, the ship, is you could have it injected directly into the urethra.
Oh yes, I've seen
that fabulous,
syringe.
the urethral syringe
Oh, yeah.
that they would fill up with mercury and then inject it directly into your John Thomas. And none of that would actually get rid of it, but they thought that it did. The other things that you got that was less horrific is you would have like various medicinal compounds. You know, like Lily the Pink, the song Lily the Pink, the Pink, the Pink.
Yeah.
She was really an American businesswoman called Lydia Pinkham, and she developed something called Pinkham's tonic. It was just vegetable compounds, really. But it was said to be cured, to be able to cure absolutely everything, like syphilis and venereal infection was one of the things it said that it could cure. So people would be swigging things like that.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
There were Victorian condoms, right?
There were Victorian condoms.
You're grimacing slightly.
There were Victorian condom shops as well. There was one in Half Moon Street in near West Soho is today. And you would go, and they were called armour. You'd refer to them as an armour or a machine. Casanova called them English raincoats. You could buy them in a shop, but you might also be able to buy them in a pub or in a brothel or perhaps from a waiter. They were made of animal guts.
Yeah.
So normally pig guts, but sometimes fish skins were used as well. The membrane would be scraped out, so it would be like a sausage casing, basically, right? And then that would be left to dry, and then when you wanted to, so it would go crispy, like a just dried out skin. You'd have to you have to soak it to rehydrate it before use. So it's very sexy already. And then you'd put it onto the penis, and you'd probably have to tie it on with a ribbon or a piece of string, and it was reusable. So
And it worked?
no.
Okay.
No.
Right.
No. Well, I mean, it might have worked a bit. You can still buy animal gut condoms, but they don't protect against STIs. They protect against pregnancy because the
That's
skin
right, 'cause
isn't
presumably
porous
they
enough.
were interested in stopping pregnancies, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but they were interested in that. That was important
Yeah.
to them. But they weren't... I guess they'd have been better than nothing at all, but not by much. It'd be more like you're safer jumping out of a 5-story building than a 7-story building. It's that kind of safety thing. And they might have actually contributed to spreading STIs more because people thought they were safe when they weren't.
So actually, we like to laugh about the Victorians, think it's all quite funny. But the prevalence of syphilis, the danger of those STIs, it made it a much darker.
Incredibly dark. Yeah. Incredibly dark. There was a lot. It's not a nice history a lot of the time. It's fun because sex can be fun, but it's also really grim.
And speaking of dark sides, of course, also the issue around sex work and abuse and like the age of consent for children was slowly introduced. Well, it was introduced in this period, right?
It was 12 at the start of the 19th century, and by the end it was 16 for girls and 18 for boys. But you could still get married at 12 with your parents' permission.
Well, I won't be giving my daughter permission.
I wouldn't. No, I don't know. I don't know how
it.
often that happens.
Yeah.
But the fact it's on the books is.
If you remember the royal family and it was an important dynastic marriage.
If you were rich enough, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Tell everyone, what is your podcast called again?
My podcast is called Betwixt the Sheets: The History of Sex Scandal in Society.
Very good. Thank you very much for telling me all about it.
Anytime.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.